Mr. President, as many of us have said here before, a budget is far more than simply numbers on a page. A budget really is a statement of values and priorities and the kind of nation we are and the kind of nation we want to be. For Democrats, that means our budget should help us move towards an economy that is built from the middle out, not from the top down, and a government that works for all of our families, not just the wealthiest few. When Democrats wrote our budget last Congress, we made our values and priorities crystal clear. We put jobs, economic growth, and the middle class first. We replaced the automatic budget cuts evenly across defense and non-defense investments with an equal mix of responsible spending cuts and revenue raised by closing wasteful tax loopholes used by the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. We addressed our long-term deficit and debt challenges fairly and responsibly, and we kept our promises that we've made to our seniors and our families. Now, the Republican House didn't simply accept our budget, of course, but I'm very proud that coming out of that terrible government shutdown at the end of 2013, we were finally able to break through that gridlock and dysfunction to reach a bipartisan budget deal that put in place a budget for 2 years, prevented another government shutdown, and rolled back the worst of those automatic cuts. That deal wasn't the budget I would have written on my own, and it wasn't the one that Republicans would have written on their own. But it did end the lurching from crisis to crisis. It helped workers, it helped our economy, and made it clear that there is bipartisan support for rolling back sequestration in a balanced way. Our bipartisan deal was a strong step in the right direction, and I was hopeful that we could work now together to build on that. But, Mr. President, Republicans have taken a very different approach this year. Instead of building on our bipartisan budget deal, this Republican budget would be a huge step backwards. Instead of moving us towards a government that works for all of our families, this budget would push us towards a government that works for the wealthy and well-connected, but actually leaves the middle class and working families behind. Mr. President, we know there is bipartisan support to replace sequestration in a balanced and fair way. Not only did we prove that with our bipartisan budget deal last time, but Democrats and Republicans across the country have continued to come out against the senseless cuts to defense and non-defense investments. But in this Republican budget, a budget that aims nearly 70% of all of its spending cuts at programs that combat poverty, that cuts more than $1 trillion from Medicare and Medicaid, that calls for a total of $5 trillion in spending cuts. In this budget, my Republican colleagues couldn't even find a single penny to pay for more investments in education or research or defense investments for this coming year. Just to put that in perspective, the budget agreement that I reached with Chairman Paul Ryan in 2013 found $85 billion in savings to pay for sequester relief for over 2 years. That's less than 2% of the total savings that this Republican budget claims to have in it. And yet, the across-the-board cuts to both defense and non-defense priorities remain in place. Why is that? Well, instead of using just a tiny fraction of the enormous cuts in this budget has in it to pay for the investments that both Republicans and Democrats agree must be made, it relies on a gimmick and increases OCO funding to appear to patch over the problem on the defense side, but then doesn't actually allow for the increased OCO funding to be even spent, and does nothing at all for non-defense investments like education and research and jobs or infrastructure. Mr. President, I know our Republican colleagues are sincere when they say they want to find a way to increase the caps, especially for defense purposes. But this budget in front of us today simply does not do that. Gimmicks and lip service are not enough for me, and I don't see why they're enough for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, especially given the deliberate choice not to use any of the $5 trillion in cuts in this to pay for some relief, a choice that should greatly concern anyone who genuinely wants to fix this problem. So, Mr. President, I come to the floor to offer another way, a way that would make it clear that we will, in fact, fix those senseless across-the-board cuts known as sequestration. My amendment builds on the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013 and extends the replacement of sequestration through fiscal years 2016 and 2017. This amendment maintains the principle that Democrats will not abandon, that sequestration should be replaced evenly across defense and non-defense investments. And it builds on the idea that sequestration should be replaced with a mix of responsible spending cuts and new revenue raised by closing wasteful tax loopholes. By providing defense with real resources to replace the sequester cuts, it gets rid of the OCO gimmick that was added in committee. And finally, it includes language to automatically release the additional defense and non-defense funding to the Appropriations Committee upon the increase of the statutory caps, similar to the language that we passed in the previous budget. Now, Mr. President, we all know there's going to have to be a solution to these automatic cuts. President Obama has said that he would not sign spending bills that lock in sequestration. And the fact of the matter is we simply can't make the investments we need to make on both defense and non-defense if those caps remain in place. We should be able to give our appropriations committees the guidance that they need to write responsible bills at bipartisan levels and not wait for another crisis to hit before we can come together to make a deal. Mr. President, I know there are Republicans who understand how devastating the automatic cuts are for defense and non-defense investments. I know there are Republicans who understand the value of investing in jobs and infrastructure and education and in research. I know there are Republicans who've seen the impact of sequestration in their states, the way I've seen it in my home state of Washington. And I know there are Republicans who look at this budget and wonder why it couldn't use some of the trillions of dollars in cuts to reinvest in American innovation or in our defense investments. So I'm ready to work with any Republican truly interested in building on the bipartisan budget deal in a balanced and responsible way, and I know my colleagues will stand with me. Because, Mr. President, to us, this is about middle-class economics, plain and simple. We believe that when working families do well, they spend more, they boost demand, and they grow the economy in a healthy and sustainable way. We believe that when low-income families are offered a hand up and an opportunity to get a job or earn more or join the middle class, that means more taxpayers, less need for housing, less need for nutrition support, and it means a growing economy. We believe that the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations should pay a bit more for their fair share. And we believe that replacing these automatic cuts in a fair and responsible way is an important part of moving towards an economy that works for our families, not just the wealthiest few. So I really urge my colleagues to support this amendment so we can agree now on responsible and realistic top-line spending numbers for this year, so that we can restore those investments in critical defense and non-defense programs, and so we can start right away in the appropriations committees to do our work and not wait until September for another crisis, another government shutdown, and the whole country looking at us as if we can't manage our way anywhere. So, Mr. President, if my Republican colleagues have any other ideas for how to get this done, my door's open. I'm ready to get to work. But I hope that we can support this amendment when we vote on it later this afternoon so that we can get to work and not have another summer and another fall where the American public looks at Congress wondering if we can't get our act together. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.